The woman on the tracks. Jack settles into the worn seat of the late-night train, his back pressing against the cold, cracked vinyl. Rain beats against the windows, smearing the world outside into a dark, shapeless blur of black and gray. The carriage sits empty, save for him, its low hum vibrating through the floor. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzz and flicker, casting jagged shadows with every lurch of the tracks. His breath escapes in faint wisps, the air sharp and chilled inside the metal shell. He'd sprinted through the storm to make this ride, and now his coat hangs heavy on his shoulders, soaked through with water that clings to his skin like a second layer. The train jolts forward, wheels grinding against steel with a low, grating screech that echoes in the stillness. He leans his head back, eyes half closed, the steady clatter of the rails tugging him toward a restless doze. He's alone, or so he assumes, until the doors slide open with a sharp hiss at the next stop, a desolate platform swallowed by the night beyond. A woman steps into the carriage, her figure hunched beneath a dripping coat that gleams wet under the dim lights. Water pools beneath her boots as she moves down the aisle, each step slow and deliberate, her hair plastered to her face in dark, sodden strands that hide her features. She collapses into the seat across from him, silent, her head bowed low, hands resting limp in her lap like forgotten things. Jack shifts uncomfortably, the damp fabric of his own coat sticking to the seat. A sour smell wafts from her, faint at first, like mud churned up from a stagnant pond, sharp enough to prickle his nose. The train jolts again, rocking slightly. She doesn't move, doesn't react, just sits there, still as stone. He steals a glance, then looks away quick, the silence stretching taut between the rhythmic thud of the wheels against the tracks. Her lips twitch, barely noticeable, muttering something too soft to catch over the engine's low drone. The lights flicker overhead, a brief stutter of brightness. She lifts her head, slow and deliberate, and Jack's stomach twists into a tight knot. Her eyes glow red, raw and swollen, as if she's been crying for days without pause, the whites crisscrossed with jagged veins that pulse faintly. Her pupils quiver, small and unsteady, locking onto him with an intensity that pins him to his seat. Her lips move faster now, shaping words he can't hear over the rain's relentless drumming, a silent chant lost in the noise. He grips the armrest, knuckles whitening, his pulse thudding loud in his ears. The air thickens, heavy with that sour stench rolling off her soaked coat, sharper now, biting at his throat. "Hey," he mutters, his voice rough from the cold. "You okay over there?" She doesn't answer. Her eyes don't blink, just stare, red and wet, cutting through him like a blade. The train picks up speed, wheels clacking louder against the steel. She leans forward, just a fraction, her whisper breaking through the din. "Where's my?" The words crack, hoarse and jagged, fading into a rasp that hangs in the air. Jack pulls back, his coat scraping against the seat, the sound loud in the quiet. Her fingers twitch, reaching toward him, pale and trembling, nails crusted with dark, wet grime that glints under the flickering light. The smell hits harder, rotten and earthy, like swamp water trapped in the folds of her clothes, thick enough to gag him. He turns his head, heart pounding, staring out the window into the void. Rain streaks the glass in frantic lines, but there's nothing beyond, just an endless stretch of darkness swallowing the tracks whole. The train doesn't slow. She stands, jerky and unsteady, shuffling toward the door. Her coat drags behind her, leaving a trail of murky drips across the floor that shimmer faintly in the weak light. He watches, breath caught tight in his chest. She presses her hands to the glass, staring out into the black, but no stop appears, only the night rushing past in a blur. She turns, slow and deliberate. Her eyes find him again, red and raw, unblinking. Her whisper grows louder. "You saw him, didn't you?" His chest locks up, breath stuck halfway. Her voice slices through the air, sharp and fractured, each word a splinter digging into his nerves. Her fingers curl against the door, leaving wet smears that glisten like oil under the flickering lights. The train jolts hard, rocking on its frame. The lights blink out, plunge the carriage into black, then snap back with a harsh buzz. She's gone. The seat sits empty, stark and bare. The smell lingers, sour and rancid, clinging to the air. His nose, his skin, a stubborn stain he can't shake. He leans forward, checks her spot. The fabric's damp, dark patches spreading slow, soaked through with that boggy rot that stings his eyes. His hands shake as he stands, stumbling toward the next carriage, desperate for distance. It's empty too, seats untouched, but the smell follows, faint yet biting, clawing at his throat with every breath. The train slows at last, a groan of metal on metal. Doors hiss open. He steps onto the platform, deserted and slick with rain, the sound drumming loud overhead. He hurries home, coat heavy on his shoulders, the night pressing in close, a weight he can't outrun. Morning creeps in, gray and sluggish, the storm leaving puddles that gleam dully outside his window. Jack sits at his kitchen table, coffee steaming in a chipped mug, scrolling his phone with restless fingers. The memory of her eyes gnaws at him, sharp and relentless, a splinter lodged deep in his mind. A headline blinks onto the screen: woman hit by train, body missing. His cup slips, clatters against the wood, spills hot liquid across his hand. He barely feels the burn, eyes locked on the words. The article's short, clipped. Last night, same line, a woman in a coat struck on the tracks. No body recovered, just scraps of wet fabric tangled in the gravel, marked by the rain. His chest tightens, a vice squeezing his ribs. The smell creeps back, faint and sour, lodged in his mind. His clothes, a ghost he can't banish. He grabs his coat from the chair, scrubs it in the sink with frantic hands. Water runs brown, murky, swirling down the drain, but the stench sticks, subtle under the soap, a shadow woven into the fabric. Night falls again, heavy and wet. He's back on the train, same route, same seat, no choice but to ride. Rain hammers harder, a relentless drum against the windows, rattling the glass in its frame. He tells himself it's nothing, just a fluke, a trick of tired eyes, but his hands grip the armrest, fingers digging into the worn metal. His eyes dart to the doors, watching, waiting. They hiss open, a sharp sound that cuts through the quiet. She's there. Same dripping coat, same slow shuffle, closer this time. She sits beside him, her presence a weight that presses against his side. His breath catches, sharp and shallow. Her smell rolls over him, rotten and thick, like mud and decay churned from a drowned pit, heavy enough to choke him. She turns her head, slow and deliberate. Her eyes gleam redder, veins pulsing beneath the surface, staring into him with a hunger he can't name. Her whisper rasps, low and rough, you know where he is. Her hand moves, jerky and sudden, brushing his sleeve. Her fingers feel cold, wet, slick with grime that leaves a faint smear on his coat. Jack jolts, slides away, pressing himself against the window. She doesn't follow, but her eyes stay, red and unblinking, cutting through the dim light like twin embers. The train clatters on, wheels pounding the tracks. Her coat drips louder, louder, a steady patter that echoes in the empty space. A puddle forms beneath her seat, mucky and spreading, creeping toward his boots with a slow, deliberate crawl. He stands, heart slamming against his ribs, stumbles back a step. She doesn't move, just watches, her lips trembling as they form. Words, tell me. The lights flicker, a brief stutter of power. Her shadow stretches, long and jagged, across the floor, the walls, brushing his legs with its edges. He grabs his bag, fingers fumbling at the zipper, checks his pocket. Something weighs it down, heavy and damp. He pulls out a soggy cloth handkerchief, stained and reeking of swamp rot, the smell sharp enough to sting his eyes. His fingers burn, cold and numb where the fabric touches his skin. He drops it, kicks it away with a quick, panicked shove. The train screeches to a stop, brakes, groaning. She's gone. The puddle remains, dark and wet, his sleeves damp, marked by her touch. The smell clings, sour and rancid, burrowing into his skin, his lungs, his fear. He staggers off the train, legs unsteady on the platform, rain soaking him through in seconds. The space stands empty, rain drumming loud overhead. But the smell won't fade, rotten and alive, a companion he can't shake. His boots squelch on the concrete, leaving faint smears of mud behind. He hurries home, locks the door with shaking hands, breath short and ragged in his chest. He scrubs his hands, his coat, hot water steaming up the sink, but the stench lingers, faint and sharp, under his nails, in his hair, a stubborn mark that won't wash away. He lies awake that night, eyes burning, staring at the ceiling. Every creak of the house twists into her whisper, a faint echo that worms into his skull. Red eyes flash in the dark, vivid and unyielding. Her voice loops, soft but insistent. You saw him. Sleep evades him, slipping through his grasp. The smell grows, sour and damp, filling the room. His nose, his mind, a presence he can't banish. He checks his coat, hung dry by the door, but the pocket's damp again. Another cloth, hers, wet and heavy, crumpled inside like it crawled back. His stomach lurches, a cold wave rolling through him. He throws it out, locks the door tighter, double-checks the bolt, but the smell persists, rotten and unyielding, curling around him, choking his breath. The next night, he's back on the train. No choice in the matter. Work demands it, the schedule unforgiving. Rain pounds the carriage, a steady roar against the windows, his breath fogging in the cold air. He sits, tense, watching the doors with wary eyes. They hiss open, a sound that slices through the quiet. She's there, closer still, sitting right beside him, without pause. Her coat brushes his leg, wet and heavy, the fabric cold against his jeans. The smell slams into him, rotten and thick, like decay pulled from a drowned pit, a weight that presses against his chest. She leans in, slow and deliberate, her breath hitting his ear, cold and damp, a whisper rasping through. Give him back. Her eyes, red and raw, lock onto his, pupils twitching like trapped insects. Her fingers grip his wrist, icy and slimy, nails digging in, leaving wet streaks that glisten faintly. He yanks free, stumbles to his feet, nearly falls. Her coat drips louder, louder, the puddle spreading, mucky and warm, lapping at his boots with a slow, hungry edge. He scrambles back, heart pounding loud in his ears. The train jolts hard, rocking on its frame. Lights die, plunging the carriage into black. She's gone when they snap back. His wrist burns, red marks stinging where her nails raked him. His boots stick, mud clinging to the soles. The smell chokes him, sour and rancid, filling his lungs, his fear, his every breath. He bolts off the train at the next stop, legs shaking as he hits the platform. Rain drenches him in moments, but the smell follows, rotten and alive, a shadow he can't outrun. His boots squelch, leaving muddy smears across the concrete that gleam under the faint platform lights. He checks his bag, hands trembling. It's wet, heavier than it should be. Inside, her handkerchief, crumpled and dripping, his name scratched into the fabric, crooked and fresh, the ink still wet. His heart hammers, a frantic beat against his ribs. He throws it into the rain, watches it land in a puddle, runs home through the storm, locks snapping shut behind him. The smell grows, sour and damp, seeping through the walls, the floor, his skin, a presence that won't relent. He washes, scrubs his hands, his arms, until his skin stings red, water running gray down the drain. But the stench sticks, rotten and heavy, under his nails, in his throat, his mind. Red eyes haunt his thoughts, vivid and unyielding. Her whisper loops, louder now. Give him back. Another night, the train again. No escape from the routine. Work's relentless, a chain he can't break. He sits alone, rain hammering the windows, with a fury that rattles the glass. The doors hiss open, a sharp, cutting sound. She's there, right beside him, no hesitation this time. Her coat drips louder, the smell slamming into him, rotten and thick, a wave of decay that presses against his chest. Her eyes, red and raw, stare unblinking, cutting through the dim light with a hunger he can't escape. Her voice rasps, sharp and hoarse. You took him. Her hand grabs, fast and sudden, nails raking his arm, wet and cold, leaving streaks of grime that burn against his skin. He pulls away, screams, the sound raw in his throat. The train lurches, rocking hard. She's gone. The mirror across the aisle catches his eye, a faint glimmer in the dark. Her face stares back, red eyes, lips moving, his name forming slow and deliberate on her mouth. A puddle grows beneath his seat, mucky and warm, swirling with a life of its own. His boots sink, mud gripping the soles. He leaps up, stumbles toward the doors. They open with a hiss. He falls onto the platform, rain soaking him, mud clinging, the smell choking him, sour and rancid, burrowing into his lungs. His fear. He staggers home, locks snapping shut with a desperate click, breath short and ragged in his chest. The mirror in the hall stands clean, but the smell grows, rotten and heavy, filling the room. His nose, his mind. His phone buzzes, slips from his hand, clatters to the floor. The screen lights up, a photo from last night's train glowing bright. Him, slumped in the seat, head lolling. Her, standing over him, eyes red, coat dripping, whispering something he can't hear. His boots in the shot, muddy and wet, though the floor beneath him stays dry. The smell slams in, sour and damp, sharper. Now, his hands tremble as he scrubs them. Nothing works. Red eyes flash in his head, vivid and unyielding. Her voice grows louder, echoing through his skull. You're mine now. He stands, slow and unsteady, checks the mirror again. Her face looms. Behind him, red eyes, lips moving, his name a silent chant. A puddle forms beneath his feet, mucky and warm, spreading slow across the wood. He turns, fast and frantic. She's gone. His boots drip mud, fresh and wet, though he hasn't left the house. The smell chokes him, rotten and heavy, filling his lungs, his fear, his every breath. Days blur into weeks, a haze of rain and dread. Jack avoids the train, walks hours through the storm, his legs aching. But she's there every night, on the platform, waiting. Her coat drips, eyes red, whispering closer with each passing day. The smell follows, sour and rancid, clinging to his clothes, his skin, his mind, a companion he can't shake. He moves, new place, new route, packing his life into boxes with trembling hands. But the train finds him, always, its rumble a constant hum in the distance. The doors hiss open wherever he goes. She's inside, beside him, her presence a weight that presses against his side. Her voice cuts through the quiet. You can't leave. Her fingers brush his arm, cold and slimy, leaving faint streaks that burn. Her eyes lock onto his, red and raw, unblinking. The puddle spreads beneath her seat, mucky and warm, lapping at his boots. The smell chokes him, rotten and alive, filling his lungs, his fear. He runs, falls onto the platform, mud clinging to his hands, his knees. Her whisper follows, soft but relentless. Mine. Weeks stretch into months, a slow unraveling of his life. Jack quits work, hides indoors, curtains drawn tight against the rain that taps the windows like restless fingers. The smell won't leave, sour and rancid, seeping into his walls, his clothes, his skin, a shadow that grows with every passing day. He checks the mirror daily, a habit born of dread. His reflection blurs, eyes reddening at the edges, veins creeping in slow and steady. His hands stay cold, nails darkening, peeling at the edges, a faint grime settling beneath them. The phone buzzes endlessly, photos piling up in a grim gallery. Him on the train, her over him, whispering. His boots crust with mud, though he hasn't stepped outside in weeks. The smell chokes him, rotten and heavy, filling his house, his mind, his fear. He hears her whisper in the walls, the floor, his skull, a constant murmur that won't fade. Give him back. Months crawl by, a relentless march of dread. Jack's a shell, locked inside, avoiding mirrors, trains, rain, anything that might summon her. The smell grows, sour and rancid, thicker than ever, a presence that fills his life, his lungs, his skin. His eyes sting red at the edges, veins pulsing faintly beneath the surface. His lips twitch, moving on their own, forming words. He doesn't choose. He stands, slow and unsteady, checks the mirror one last time. His face blurs, eyes red, veins vivid and crawling, staring back with a hunger he doesn't recognize. His voice rasps, not his own. Where's my? The words choke out, hoarse and broken, a sound that rattles in his chest. His hands tremble, cold and slimy, nails black and jagged, peeling away in flakes. A puddle forms under his chair, mucky and warm, spreading slow across the floor, a living thing that pulses faintly. The phone buzzes, screen lighting up with a cold, harsh glow. A photo him, now, eyes red, whispering into the dark. Her handkerchief sits in his lap, wet and alive, curling against his skin like a hand seeking warmth. He coughs, the smell choking him, rotten and heavy, filling his lungs, his mind, his fear. His lips taste mud, sour and thick, a flavor that lingers on his tongue. The room grows cold, the air heavy with that swampy rot. He sits, shaking, the puddle spreading, warm and mucky, lapping at his boots. The whisper grows louder, echoing through his skull. You're mine. His eyes burn, redder now, veins pulsing stronger, a mirror of hers. His hands move, slow and jerky, reaching for nothing, cold and slick with grime. Epilogue. Weeks later. Jack's silent, a ghost in his own home. The neighbor knocks, a tentative rap against the door, no answer. The knob turns, unlocked. swings open slow into a stillness that presses against the skin. The smell hits first, sour and rancid, thick and suffocating, a wall of rot that stings the eyes. The room sits empty, boots crusted with mud by the chair, a puddle beneath, mucky and warm, still, spreading slow across the wood, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. The phone lies cracked on the floor, screen glowing, photo after photo flickering. Him on the train, her over him, eyes red, whispering into the dark. The neighbor steps back, voice shaking, barely a whisper. She lived here once, years back, lost her son on those tracks, screamed for him till the train took her whole. Never stopped looking, even after. The mirror flickers, Jack's face staring out, eyes red, veins pulsing, lips moving slow. Where's my? His voice rasps through the walls, hoarse and broken, a sound that lingers in the air. The puddle pulses, alive and warm, reaching out with slow, deliberate tendrils across the floor. The neighbor turns, runs, door slamming shut with a hollow thud. The train rattles past in the distance, a low rumble that shakes the ground. Her face presses the window, eyes red, whispering his name into the night. Jack's hers now, her son, her echo, her curse, trapped in a night that reeks of rot, a fear that drowns him forever. His eyes, red and raw, stare from the mirror, unblinking. His lips moving, hoarse and broken. Where's my? The puddle grows, mucky and warm, swallowing the room, the house, his life. The phone buzzes, screen glowing, a final photo. Him, standing, eyes red, whispering her words, her handkerchief alive in his hands, curling tight. The train rolls on, endless, her voice inside him, sour and rancid, a shadow. He can't escape, a fear that owns him wholly.